Kyiv, February 24th, 2022. The night sky glows red with artillery. Sirens echo through the frozen streets as Russian tanks roll across the border. A moment decades in the making. Inside the Kremlin, a solitary man sits beneath the gilded double-headed eagle, signing decrees that will shatter the post-Cold War order. Cameras flash. Aides stand frozen. The pen trembles for a fraction of a second. Not from hesitation, but calculation. How did a boy from a rat-infested apartment in post-war Leningrad become the man who now redraws Europe's map? To understand the invasion, one must return to the ruins, to the hunger, fear, and quiet ambition that forged Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. Putin was born on October 7, 1952, in Leningrad, the city that had barely survived one of the most brutal sieges in human history. His parents were survivors in every sense. His father, Vladimir Spiridonovich Putin, had fought in the Great Patriotic War and returned wounded but alive. His mother, Maria Ivanovna, had already buried 2 sons before Vladimir was born. For them, survival itself was a form of victory. Yet within that modest household ran a quiet thread of proximity to power. Putin's grandfather, Spiridon, was once a personal cook to Lenin and later Stalin. It was whispered that he might have worked for the NKVD, the Soviet secret police. Young Vladimir grew up hearing stories not of heroism, but of vigilance. That those who served close to the throne lived, and those who questioned it disappeared. In that family kitchen, power was never abstract. It was heat, close enough to burn, yet vital to survive. The Leningrad of Putin's childhood was a city rebuilding from ashes. Bombed-out courtyards, stray dogs, and gangs of boys who fought for territory between crumbling apartment blocks. Putin joined them. Small, wiry, feral in instinct. His teachers would later recall him as a boy with too much energy and not enough fear. He learned early that life in the Soviet system was not about fairness, but control. You didn't need to be the biggest to win a fight, only to strike first and never show weakness. Those lessons, taught in bruises and back-alley dust, would become his political creed decades later. If the fight is inevitable, strike first. At school, Putin was restless but sharp. He studied law at Leningrad State University, drawn not to justice but to systems, the invisible codes of authority. He joined the Communist Party less out of ideology than necessity, and found a mentor in Anatoly Sobchak, a law professor who would later become a key figure in Russia's post-Soviet transformation. But beneath the academic veneer, another current pulled him. Soviet TV had its heroes, stoic spies in leather coats who served the motherland with silent devotion. To the young Putin, they were knights in a new order. One man could make a difference, he would later recall. In 1975, he joined the KGB. There, he would learn the true language of power: patience, deception, and the weaponization of silence. The boy from Leningrad had finally found his machine. When Vladimir Putin came of age in the 1960s, the Soviet Union was at once triumphant and exhausted. The scars of Stalin's terror had faded, replaced by new skyscrapers and televised parades of rockets. Economic growth was steady, propaganda triumphant. Yet under the surface, the empire was hollowing out. Bureaucracy replaced belief. Faith in Marxism had turned into ritual obedience. Putin's generation grew up under Brezhnev's era of stagnation, where power rewarded loyalty more than brilliance. The state promised equality, but what mattered was who controlled the keys to a car, an apartment, a future. He learned early that the system could not be fought from the outside. It had to be infiltrated. The Cold War taught him the same. The West was richer, freer, but also fragile. Behind every revolution was a hand unseen. For a young KGB recruit, that was the ultimate truth. The world was a chessboard, not a battlefield. In the late 1980s, while stationed in Dresden, East Germany, Putin watched the Soviet world unravel. Protests filled the streets. The Berlin Wall fell, and with it, everything the KGB had sworn to defend. From his office window, he reportedly watched crowds storm local headquarters, burning files, chanting for freedom. Moscow gave no orders. The empire was silent. That night, he realized something fundamental. The system he served would not protect him. When he returned to Russia in 1990, the old world had collapsed. But Putin, the survivor, did what he always had. He adapted. In the new St. Petersburg, he found his old mentor, Sobchak, now mayor, and offered a skill the new Russia desperately needed: control disguised as order. Where others saw chaos, he saw opportunity, a vacuum that begged to be filled. Between the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the USSR, Putin witnessed humiliation, not just for the state, but for an entire generation. Overnight, the superpower that once terrified the world was bankrupt, mocked, and dismembered. The 1990s brought gangsters, hunger, and Western consultants who treated Russia like a lab experiment in capitalism. For Putin, this was not freedom. It was betrayal. His ideological evolution wasn't Marxist or democratic. It was psychological. He concluded that Russia could not survive without a centralized will, that chaos was the natural enemy of civilization. His faith was not in communism or religion, but in vertical power, the conviction that the state must be feared to be respected. He once said, "A weak man can't defend his motherland." In that sentence lies his entire worldview, a fusion of Soviet discipline, imperial nostalgia, and street fighter pragmatism. By the mid-1990s, Putin was ready to turn this creed into policy. Putin's ascent was quiet, almost surgical. By 1996, he had moved from St. Petersburg to Moscow, into the chaotic heart of Yeltsin's Russia. The old system was gone, but its instincts remained: loyalty, secrecy, leverage. He joined the presidential administration, first managing property deals, then the security apparatus. Each promotion tightened his grip. In 1998, he was appointed head of the FSB, the modern KGB. A year later, Yeltsin, frail, alcoholic, desperate for stability, named him prime minister. It was a calculated gamble. The unknown officer from Leningrad could preserve the crumbling regime. Putin accepted. But behind that polite, obedient expression was a single thought: never again will Russia kneel. The year 1999 produced the decisive turn. Russia was staggering through chaos, and a frail Boris Yeltsin needed an heir who could promise order. Vladimir Putin, newly vaulted from the security services to prime minister, stepped into the glare. That autumn, a wave of apartment bombings terrified the country. The Kremlin blamed Chechen militants and launched a new war in the North Caucasus. The televised images were unambiguous. A leader in a crisp field jacket speaking with clipped certainty, promising to hunt terrorists in the outhouse if necessary. The message landed. Whether by design or fortune, crisis became the proving ground. Putin's approval soared on the promise of safety. On December 31, 1999, Yeltsin resigned and handed him the presidency. Overnight, the quiet functionary became the man responsible for rebuilding a state. The implicit bargain was simple. If Russians would trade a measure of liberty for stability and rising living standards, the Kremlin would deliver order, salaries paid on time, a currency that did not evaporate, and a flag that no longer felt like an apology. It was the same logic he learned as a boy in Leningrad's courtyards. Control wins the street, control wins the state. The first years were about constructing a vertical of power. The blueprint was methodical. First, consolidate the information space. Independent television, especially the network that had mocked the state in the 1990s, was brought to heel through legal pressure, ownership changes, and tax cases. Second, disassemble rival power centers. Regional governors lost their direct electoral freedom when the Kremlin introduced appointment mechanisms, then re-engineered electoral rules to ensure loyalty. Third, co-opt the oligarchs. Those who accepted the new rules of mutual benefit kept their empires. Those who challenged the center became examples. Inside the government, he elevated the Siloviki, veterans of the security services who shared his instincts for secrecy and discipline. Courts, prosecutors, tax police, and state corporations were aligned to form a single lever. The economy provided fuel. Energy prices climbed through the 2000s, wages rose, pensions stabilized, and Moscow's skyline filled with cranes. To most citizens, life became materially better. That mattered more than constitutional theory. This was not ideology in a textbook. It was logistics. Who owns the broadcast tower? Who signs the licenses? Who controls ports, pipelines, and prosecutors? A country the size of a continent was transformed into a chain of command. Power needs a stage. Putin understood the grammar of images. Judo mats and weight rooms signaled discipline. Amphibious rides, flyovers, and taiga photo ops projected vigor. The Sochi Olympics announced a modern nation with glittering stadiums and a winter by the sea. Victory Day parades stitched present authority to past sacrifice. Abroad, the shows were sharper. The 2008 war in Georgia framed Russia as the enforcer of red lines. In 2014, the seizure of Crimea became a televised homecoming, complete with stadium speeches and flags resurrected from imperial memory. Each spectacle did double work. It rallied the base and warned the elite. It told a story of restoration after humiliation, of the state made muscular again. In this theater, the leader was both narrator and protagonist. Images did not decorate policy. They were policy. The interlude with Dmitry Medvedev as president from 2008 to 2012 proved the limits of delegation. When Putin returned to the Kremlin in 2012, protests flared in Moscow. The response hardened. Laws narrowed the space for dissent, foreign funding for civil society was restricted, and arrests followed. The message to insiders was plainer still. The 2020 constitutional changes reset presidential terms, signaling a future measured not in political cycles but in decades. Abroad, the confrontations intensified. Crimea's annexation and the shadow war in the Donbass rewired Europe's security map and triggered sanctions. But they also spiked domestic approval. Intervention in Syria demonstrated expeditionary capability and a willingness to prop allies at any cost. Energy policy tightened dependencies across the continent. By late 2021, the board was set. Russian troops massed near Ukraine. The calculations were familiar. Speed, surprise, leverage. A short war could break Kiev's will, fracture Western unity, and force a settlement that made Russia's sphere of influence explicit again. On February 24, 2022, Putin crossed the point of no return. The gamble would define his legacy, and the bill would arrive in history's currency, not the Kremlin. Before dawn on February 24, 2022, the lights over Kiev went out, and the horizon lit up. Columns of armor pushed across borders from multiple directions. Airfields and command posts were struck in the opening salvo. Inside the Kremlin, a familiar choreography unfolded. The televised address, heavy with history, the claim that Ukraine was not a real state, the pledge to demilitarize and denazify. It was meant to be a thunderclap. Shock, panic, collapse. But the narrative diverged as soon as it met resistance. Ukrainian units held the line around Kiev. Columns bogged down on highways, fuel trucks stranded, air assaults repelled at Hostomel. Russian logistics strained. Communications faltered. The quick decapitation strike became street-by-street attrition. In Moscow, the image machines strained to keep pace with battlefield reality. Yet for Putin, the order had already done its deeper work. Crossing the border was not just a military act, it was an irreversible statement of identity and intent. It fused his personal story, humiliation avenged, state restored, with a generational confrontation against the West. The gamble demanded total follow-through, whatever the cost. By nightfall, the map of Europe felt older, harsher, more brittle. The Cold War's ghost had been made flesh, and the man who summoned it believed history would forgive what it could not prevent. Sanctions arrived in waves. Banks cut off, reserves frozen, export controls tightened. European capitals scrambled to unwind a decades-long addiction to Russian energy. Weapons flowed into Ukraine as governments shifted from caution to urgency. At home, protests flared and were quickly smothered. Independent media sites went dark. Words like war vanished from official vocabulary, replaced by euphemism and law. The ruble wobbled, then stabilized under emergency controls. Elite networks rerouted capital through friendlier jurisdictions. The security services dug in for a long campaign against dissent. Abroad, Russia found new corridors, to Asia for energy, to the Middle East and Africa for leverage and clients. The international stage narrowed but did not disappear. Militarily, the lightning strike had failed to Kyiv. The war shifted east and south, toward sieges and artillery duels, toward trenches and drones. A quick victory had become a test of endurance, of industry, manpower, alliances, and narrative stamina. To supporters, Putin is the restorer, the leader who ended the drift of the 1990s, rebuilt the state, checked NATO's reach, reclaimed Crimea, and forced the world to treat Russia as a pole of power rather than a cautionary tale. They point to rising wages in the 2000s, modernized cities, the reassertion of national pride, and a willingness to act where others lecture. To critics, he is the arsonist of order, the architect of a vertical that crushed institutions, the captor of media and courts, the author of wars that bled Russia's future for imperial memory. They cite poisoned opponents, broken treaties, shattered towns, and a generation for whom passports and prospects narrowed. Even economic strength, they argue, rests on extractive rents, sanctions workarounds, and the brittleness of mobilization. Both portraits draw from the same source material. The divergence lies in the weighting of fear and dignity, stability and freedom, map lines and human lives. The question at the start was simple and ruthless. How did a boy from a courtyard gang become the man who tried to redraw Europe by force? The through line is not ideology but temperament. An operator raised on scarcity and humiliation, fluent in systems and leverage, convinced that chaos devours nations, and only fear compels respect. The invasion was the logical peak of that creed, and the point at which it collided with another truth: endurance can outlast intimidation. So what remains? A country locked to a single will, and a war that defines it. Genius or villain, or both, depends on the price you're willing to accept.